Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. I'm almost done with the knit knot bag I've been working on, and it's time for me to do the task that many knitters dread: weave in the yarn tails. Before I go any further, let me just say there is no one singular right way to weave in loose ends that works for every knitter in every situation. So I'll share the overall approach and philosophy that works best for me. The purpose of weaving in the yarn tail is to secure this little loose end and prevent it from coming undone and unraveling your fabric. There are three things I like to consider as I'm executing this task. Number one, how do I make my yarn tails as inconspicuous as possible? I don't want the tails to add any sort of unnecessary bulk to the fabric or to disrupt my stitch work. For me, neatness matters. Number two, how do I maintain the elasticity of the fabric? I don't want weaving in the tail to change how the fabric is naturally supposed to stretch and move. For a bag like this, that may not be a big deal, but for a garment, it would be, especially in areas where the fabric needs to stretch in a certain direction to be worn comfortably, like the cuff of a sweater, sock, or mittens, or around the band of a hat. It's also important that the woven in tails don't hinder how a garment, like a shawl or a scarf, is naturally supposed to drape. Finally, number three, can I solve any problems with the tail before I weave it in? That means I generally like to seam pieces together with the yarn tails. And in certain situations, I also like to use the tails to reinforce potential weak spots or problems in the fabric. While I'm knitting, there is another consideration: how to prevent pesky yarn tails in the first place. For that, I usually depend on the Russian join. Now I'll turn my bag inside out and demonstrate my approach to weaving in yarn tails in three different situations. First, across a seam. Next, weaving in tails in a stitch pattern. And finally, weaving in a tail along a ridged edge or ribbing. Let's get started. I have two tails to weave in at the top of my bag straps. So let's think about my three tail weaving considerations and learn why seams create a very natural tail hiding location. Number one, how can I make my yarn tails as inconspicuous as possible? A lot of knitters have been taught to weave in tails along the edge of their fabric whenever possible, but generally I avoid doing that. Our eyes are often drawn to the salvage of a piece. I don't want a little yarn tail popping out and distracting from the rest of my handiwork, which it inevitably will. But no one is going to see the tail if it's along a seam. Number two, how do I maintain the elasticity of the fabric? Again, weaving down the selvage would change how those stitches along the edge stretch and move. The stitches across my seam, however, are actually part of the seam allowance, so how they stretch isn't so much of a factor. Finally, can I solve any problems with the tail when I weave it in? I do have a solvable problem here. If we look closely, you'll notice there is a small gap here at the side of the seam. But if I weave the front yarn across the back fabric and the back yarn across the front fabric, it's naturally going to cause that little gap to close up. Since I'm extra picky, I'm actually going to take things even a step further. And I'm going to weave in this front yarn near the center of the seam. And then I'll weave the back yarn through the outer edges of the seam to close that up and create a nifty tail hiding tube. I have three yarn tails where I joined in new yarn to knit the straps of my bag. Again, I'll think about my three tail weaving considerations. One, how can I make my yarn tails as inconspicuous as possible? Just like before, I avoid weaving along edges because the tail will always pop out to wave hello at you. Instead, I'll look for structures in my stitch pattern where the yarn will blend in without adding bulk. Since the wrong side of my straps are primarily reverse stockinette stitch, I could work duplicate stitch across, but it would add some thickness to the fabric, and I think there's a better option. The stitch pattern in the bag creates some beautiful paths to hide my yarn here and here. And if I follow a couple of paths in a zigzag pattern, I'll have the extra security of knowing my yarn tail won't be able to wiggle free. Number two, how do I maintain the elasticity of the fabric? Since the architecture of the stitch pattern allows me to weave my yarn in diagonally on the bias instead of horizontally or vertically, my fabric should maintain its stretch. Finally, can I solve any problems with the yarn tail before I weave it in? Again, I have a solvable problem. The space in between my straps is going to be stressed every time I open up the bag, reach in, and retrieve an item. So before I start weaving, I can use the tail to reinforce this spot by working around the stitches on either side a couple of times to tighten things up right there. Finally, ribbing and ridges are great structures for yarn concealment. I'm lucky because the bottom of my bag has four well defined ridges. To make things inconspicuous, I'm going to follow this naturally raised path of the ridge. Since my ridge is curved and not horizontal or vertical to my stitches, the yarn tail shouldn't have much effect on the overall stretch of the fabric. That being said, you may be wondering why weaving a yarn tail vertically into ribbing doesn't hinder the elasticity. Quite simply, ribbing is meant to stretch horizontally around your hand when you're putting on a sweater, around your foot for socks, or around your head for hats. And in those situations, the vertical stretch of the fabric isn't nearly as important as the horizontal stretch for comfortable wear. There are no problems I need to fix with this final yarn tail. For ridges and ribs, when a stitch that you're working under slants one direction, you want to pull the tail under that stitch perpendicularly. Pull the yarn through, and then as you go to your next stitch, your yarn will magically lay parallel to the previous and next stitch that you're working under. I love geometry. Even though weaving in those pesky tails probably isn't your favorite task, I hope you enjoyed my approach to finishing. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!